In this lab, you're going to be using parametric equations to look at a graph of the unit circle, and you're also going to be graphing the sine curve and the cosine curve using parametric equations. Remember that parametric equations are simply equations for x and y that are written separately. Instead of one equation that has x and y in it, you've got an equation for x and a separate equation for y. And both of those are functions of the variable t. T is called the parameter. Now I have set up my calculator the same way yours needs to be set up. I'm working in radians, I'm in parametric mode, and I want simultaneous graphing. Take a minute and make sure that your calculator is set up the same way. And I've got equations in my calculator already to show me. Alright, I've got equations set up for sine and equations set up to show me the unit circle. Now if I press graph, what you're going to see is the unit circle generated and the sine curve generated at the same time. Now let me drag this over here and drop it. Here's the things that I'm trying to get you to kind of focus in on this. When we look at points in the first quadrant on the unit circle, those points correspond to angles from 0 radians to pi over 2 radians. Well, if we transfer 0 radians and pi over 2 radians to the x-axis, the way we've set up this viewing window, since we used an x scale of pi over 2, then the first little tick mark is pi over 2 radians. The section of the sine curve that corresponds to angles in the first quadrant is this section right here. Our y-coordinates for these points start at 0 and go to 1 on the unit circle. The y-coordinates, or sine values for the angles, start at 0 and go to 1 on the sine curve. Taking a look at the second quadrant. Think about those angles. Pi over 2 to pi. So the next little section of graph that we want to take a look at, if I think about the interval from pi over 2 to pi on the x-axis, those sine values, y-coordinates of the points on the unit circle, start at 1 and go to 0. So our sine curve starts with sine values of 1 and goes to 0. Third quadrant. The angles are pi to 3 pi over 2. So if I look at those points on the x-axis, going from pi to 3 pi over 2 is the next little section on my x-axis. The y-coordinates, or sine values, start at 0 and decrease to -1. So that corresponds to this section of the sine curve. Fourth quadrant then. Okay, angles from 3 pi over 2 to 2 pi. The y values, or sine values, of these points, or these angles, would be starting at -1 and increasing to 0. So on the sine curve, we've got y values that start at -1 and increase to 0. Next, we want to take a look at the graph of the unit circle and the cosine curve. So I've set up my parametric equations to show us the unit circle and the cosine curve at the same time, to graph them simultaneously. So now when I press graph, this is what we see. Now to emphasize a couple of things, let me drag this over here. Oops, that's not what I wanted. Make it a little bit bigger so we can draw on it. Alright, again, on the x-axis we've got angles of 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi, which correspond to the angles, the quadrantal angles on the unit circle. Now, points in the first quadrant. So we're thinking about the interval of angles between 0 and pi over 2. The cosine values are the x coordinates of those points. And those x values are starting at 1, decreasing to 0. So our cosine curve starts on the y-axis with a cosine value of 1 and decreases to a cosine value of 0. Second quadrant. The angles are pi over 2 to pi, so we're talking about the next little section on the x-axis. The x coordinates start at 0, decrease to -1. So our cosine values start at 0, decrease to a cosine value of -1. Third quadrant, the angles are pi to 3 pi over 2, which is going to correspond to the next little section on our cosine curve. Think about the x coordinates or the cosine values for those points. They start at -1 and increase to 0. So we've got a cosine value of -1, increase to a cosine value of 0 at 3 pi over 2. Then the fourth quadrant, the x coordinates are 0 to 1. Those are the cosine values. So our cosine curve starts at 0 and goes to 1.